Hi, everyone. I'm Reva Gambert of the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, and welcome to Fighting Back. Our program today is sponsored by Congregation B'nai Shalom, the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, Jewish Book Council in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. Now the introduction. Fighting Back's entire name is Fighting Back, Stan Andrews and the Birth of the Israeli Air Force. I read this book and also the first book of our two authors, Craig and Jeff Weiss. Their first book was I Am My Brother's Keeper. I highly recommend that as well. It was from a few years ago. Fighting Back is a very recent book, and both of the brothers, one in the United States and the other zooming to us from, I guess it is Tel Aviv, have been featured in Nancy Spielberg's film that we did show in our community several years ago, which was called Above and Beyond, about the Israeli Air Force and its creation. One of the brothers, Craig, is a venture capitalist and an award-winning entrepreneur. And the other, who's also an entrepreneur, is also a super marathoner and is very passionate, as his bio says, about fitness. You can ask them more personal questions if you want. In any event, it's our pleasure to introduce Craig and Jeff Weiss, authors of Fighting Back. And we do recommend getting it for your own library. It's a great gift. And for if you belong to the day school or you are connected to a synagogue, think about purchasing it. It will really be a very good addition to any institution. Thank you very much, Craig and Jeff. Take it away.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it and really appreciate the opportunity. I'm assuming everyone can see the screen. This is
actually the screen is not, the shared screen went away. You can reshare it.
Oh, it did? Let's see. 1 second.
Yep, it's here. Yes, it's
okay,
here.
Good. Great. So sorry about that. So this is Stan Andrews. He will basically, Craig and I spent a significant part of nearly 25 years chasing after Stan's story, what drove him, the things that he accomplished in his quite dazzling and impressive life. And it was quite a journey for us. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you will get a sense as to why we found Stan to be so compelling and so worthy of having a book written about him and his accomplishments. We first came across Stan Andrews when we were doing research for our first book, I Am My Brother's Keeper. We wrote that book about the Americans and also Canadians, about 1,000 or so, who in 1948 went to Israel to help in the fight in its War of Independence against the 5 Arab armies that invaded literally the day that Israel's independence was declared on May 14th, 1948. Virtually all of them were veterans of World War II, and the ones who made, in the end, the most significant contribution to Israel's success in the war were experienced pilots from the Second World War. And so in the course of that research, and our goal, we started to write that book in 1995, and our goal was to complete our research and have the book appear in 1998, Israel's 50th anniversary, and we were able to accomplish that. In the course of talking to folks, we learned about this enigmatic, fascinating pilot named Stan Andrews, and wanted to spend more time looking very specifically at his story, but it was beyond the scope of what we were trying to do in that particular book, and we resolved to come back later and really devote ourselves specifically to Stan. It ended up being much more of a challenge, and in many ways, much more of a delight than we had anticipated.
You know, in 2000, I believe it was 13, I got a cell phone call from Steven Spielberg's youngest sister, Nancy, And she said that she wanted to produce a documentary using largely my brother and I's our book as source material, and would we be willing to be interviewed for that project, which of course we were happy to say yes. As Riva mentioned, it's a wonderful documentary. She did an amazing job, and it's been on sort of most of the streaming platforms. I think it might be on Amazon Prime these days. And we talk a little bit about Stan's story in that movie as well. So who is this guy, Stan Andrews? So this is a picture of him as a little boy. Believe it or not, that picture was submitted in a most beautiful child contest and won, to Stan's horror, because I think he was at that point a little bit older and quite embarrassed. But he grew up during the Great Depression in New York City, and was really an amazingly accomplished kid. He was a gifted artist, as you can see here, and was very talented. He was a writer. He was an artist. He liked to take photographs. You see him. He's in the bottom right-hand corner of that picture, working on a sculpture, which I actually think is pretty amazing. And so he had a tremendous versatility in terms of his talent and his capabilities. This was a very diverse sort of set of artistic skills. He called this mad surgery. So this was, a modern art piece as well. So you really see the dynamic of his early years.
So Stan, as Craig noted, grew up during the Depression. He graduated from high school actually at the age of 15 in 1939, graduated college at the age of 19 in 1943, and knew that he would be going into the military with the country at war. And he decided that he wanted to be a pilot, and in particular, he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And so he volunteered for the Army Air Corps with the goal of being accepted for pilot training. Stan's last name when he was born was Annickstein, and he was concerned that with the last name that was so obviously Jewish, he might be kept from being accepted for pilot training, which was a thing that did happen in a 1940s America that often could very openly discriminate against Jews. And so he, like so many of the folks that he knew, including one of his very best friends, resolved to solve his dilemma by changing his last name. And the name that he chose was Andrews. So let's see something here. Oh, there we go. So Stan was accepted for pilot training. He was sent to South Carolina to begin. Started off on planes very much like this one, single engine planes. And as he proceeded kind of through the training gauntlet, progressed to ever more complex aircraft. And then ultimately the Army had to decide which planes they would put him in, assign him to for his actual combat service. And he continued to push for fighters, but in the end, it was not his choice. And they sent him to bombers, and in particular to the B-25 bomber, and sent him to the Pacific, where in the end he flew over 40 missions with a highly accomplished air group called the Air Apaches. And the Air Apaches were somewhat fascinating. The way that their specialty was low altitude attacks. And this is actually a combat photo taken by one of Stan's crewmates, low altitude attacks on Japanese ships. And they would come in low, even lower actually than you're seeing in this particular picture. And they would literally skip 500-pound bombs across the water with the goal of slamming them into the side of these ships, where the bomb would then sink right below the waterline and explode. And they would also, during the attack, fire their 12 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns to, essentially hit anybody who was on the deck, manning the guns, that kind of thing. And so it was quite dazzling, exciting experience for Stan. And while he was in the military, he continued to attend to his art. That center pencil sketch, as you might have already guessed, was a self-portrait that Stan created, and then the other images were inspired by his time in the Philippines. When the fighting was over, Stan actually stayed in the service a bit longer, both because he wanted to make captain, and he was able to do that and became, at the time, one of the youngest captains in the entire Army Air Corps, and also to help with a squadron bomb group memory book that was being created. This is actually Stan drawing the kind of illustrated panel that introduced, the bomb group had 4 squadrons, and this particular one introduced his particular squadron. And he wrote 3 or 4 really fascinating essays for the memory book, ones that we tracked down a few years ago. And they really do actually shed a lot of interesting light on kind of what he was thinking about war and civilian life and death and all of the rest at this kind of very interesting point in his life as he was ending this really fascinating chapter. And this is Stan, really right at the end of his service upon returning to the States, where he separated from the service in 1946. I'll turn this part over to Craig.
So, if Stan were alive when we were doing the research for this book, and if we were able to ask him a single interview question, it would be, why? Why did you go? He was really, to be honest, the last person you would expect to volunteer and risk his life for the creation of a Jewish state. He had never set foot in a synagogue, was like essentially accidentally Jewish or nominally Jewish. His parents were probably anti-religious. And so he knew that they were from the old country and his name was Anik Stein at birth and that they were Jews, but never really considered himself particularly Jewish. And so what's amazing, though, is we got an answer to this question, and I'll read the letter in full at the end of our presentation today, but we got an unexpected answer to that question. He had actually answered that question for us in a letter to one of his best friends who held that letter for 50 years, handed it to my brother Jeff, and then passed away 3 months later. So when we got our hands on that letter, it was like Stan was speaking to us, and his reasoning was not at all what we expected, and it only deepened our intrigue into who this individual was, and we were determined to try to find out.
So basically, Stan, after the war, went to Los Angeles to study at UCLA on the GI Bill. He already had an undergraduate degree from City College of New York, and so he went to pursue a master's. And it was there that he, upon paying attention to the events that were going on in what was then known as Palestine, their newsreels about the Exodus and things of that sort, became fascinated by what was going on and decided that, he realized that there was going to be a war once the British left, and realized that the Jews would need an air force, they would need trained pilots, and he resolved to go and to volunteer his services. And so basically, what that meant at the time, so basically when the war began in May of 1948, the United Nations, at the urging of the US, actually imposed an arms embargo on the countries that were participating in the conflict. It was an embargo that really disproportionately affected the Jews, who had not been able to build an army while the British were in the country, and much less so its surrounding Arab neighbors, who actually had existing armies of various capacities. And so in the end, the only country that was willing to sell a fighter aircraft to the new Jewish state was what was then known as Czechoslovakia. And so the Czechs agreed to sell, convert these basically German Messerschmitts that were being assembled on a production line that the Czechs inherited from the Nazis after the end of the war. The Nazis had put some facilities, they tried to disperse them to protect them from Allied air attacks. And so the Czechs inherited the production line. And they also agreed to provide Israel with conversion training for pilots who, of course, had never had any experience with that particular plane. So Stan went to Czechoslovakia for his training, and Stan actually volunteered with one of his very best friends. So that's Stan on the left, the slightly shorter man, and the one on the right is Bob Vickman. And Bob was also a World War II pilot, also an artist, also assimilated, never bar mitzvahed to his family. In both cases, the families basically told us neither one ever set foot in a synagogue in their lives. And so they went to Czechoslovakia. They learned how to fly the Messerschmitt, and then made their way to Israel, and actually did so in the back of a plane that was smuggling weapons into the country. And upon arriving, they were assigned to Israel's very first fighter squadron, and indeed its only fighter squadron for the duration of the war. And this is Stan posing in front of one of these planes.
What was great is that, because everyone knew that Stan was an artist, they were in a bar in Tel Aviv, all the fighter pilots, and one of them said, well, we need a logo for the fighter squadron. Stan, aren't you an artist? Why don't you whip something up? And so what he created, which is what you see here, was actually very intriguing, because the main foe of the Israeli Air Force, and really the Israeli country in 1948, was primarily the Egyptians. Of course, Israel was attacked by all of its neighbors, and with some additional support from Iraq. But the Egyptian Air Force was the real nemesis. They were bombing Tel Aviv every day. And so Stan came up with this idea of, during the 10 plagues, it was, Egypt was our nemesis once before when we were slaves in Egypt, and it was the angel of death who visited upon the Egyptian firstborn. And so he wanted to sort of resurrect that. That's a picture of that logo on the plane that Stan flew. I took that photograph at the Israeli Air Force Museum near Beersheba, and so it was a neat opportunity, and we'll revisit that logo a little bit later on to see that he was able to put his artistic talents. He was really adept, Stan, at combining his various talents, whether that was writing, flying, his art. He had tremendous charisma and interpersonal skills, and was able to bring those to bear as well.
So basically, the War of Independence ended up being Israel's longest war. It began in May of 48 and actually continued slightly more than a year, until the final armistice agreement was signed. I believe the Syrians were the last one in the summer of 1949. The war participated in kind of fits and starts. There were periods of intense combat, and then there were truce periods before the fighting would resume again. So Stan and Bob arrived just in time for the last part of the first phase of the fighting. Stan flew a mission. And then there was a truce. And basically what was happening during the truce periods, because of this arms embargo, the United Nations had positioned within Israel, I think close to 100 truce supervisors. And the goal of these truce supervisors was to prevent Israel from bringing in any weapons in violation of the embargo, bringing in any foreign volunteers of military age to participate in the fighting, and basically to make sure that that Israel couldn't improve its military during this period, which of course for Israel was a life and death issue, because Israel was essentially creating its army on the fly as it was fighting the war. So the Air Force needed a liaison between it and the UN truce inspectors. Basically somebody who could, address their demands, but also effectively to try to keep them away from the critical airfields where the smuggling was truly occurring. And so Israel needed somebody who understood air issues, who spoke American English, and who could sort of perform that role with kind of the proper understanding, but also with some deftness and sophistication. And so they asked Stan to take it on, and they actually elevated him to the rank of major for that purpose. Now Stan had a concern, because I think about a quarter of the truce supervisors were actually Americans, and he was nervous that if they learned his name, that at the end of the war he could lose his citizenship. So he did this work under an assumed name. Andrei Stanek was the name that he chose.
So one of his responsibilities, as Jeff mentioned, was shielding these UN inspectors from Israel's efforts to smuggle in weapons that were essentially in violation of these UN truces, but because it was a life and death issue, obviously Israel had to do what they needed to do. And for those of you who may remember seeing the movie Argo, which won several Oscars, it was essentially about a fake movie production ruse to try to smuggle people out of Iran. So actually Israel did the exact same thing, but they did it first. Back in 1948, in the UK, there were half a dozen Bristol Beaufighters, which was a medium-range bomber that the British used during World War II. These planes were essentially, World War II surplus, just sort of rotting in fields. Israel arranged to procure the planes, but because of the arms embargo, there was no way to get them into Israel. So they created this fake movie production company. Had the camera crews, which you see on the right, filming these planes. They had them take off, and then they never landed. They just hopscotched their way over to Israel. So it was a bit of a scandal in the UK at the time. It made it into the newspapers. You see the political cartoon on the left, lost property office, seen anything of a couple of Beaufighters? Like, how do you lose 6, relatively large aircraft? But it was part of this Israeli operation that Stan was involved in, to the extent that he was shielding their arrival from the UN inspectors.
So as the next round of fighting was preparing to begin, these Beaufighters were placed into a new squadron, the 103 Squadron, of medium bombers. It had Beaufighters and also some Dakotas that had been converted into bombers. And by that time in the war, Israel actually had a surplus of really talented, experienced pilots with true fighter pilot training who had really filled the ranks and overfilled the ranks, in fact, of the 101 Squadron. So there was no room for Stan to go back there, and Stan wanted to take part in the next round of fighting. That's why he had come to the country in the first place. So he decided to go to the 103 Squadron and to try to learn how to fly one of the Beaufighters, because it was very much like the B-25 he had flown in World War II, and that was really where his experience, and expertise was strongest. So the fighting began again in the fall of 1948, and it was a major campaign to dislodge the Egyptian army from the Negev desert. The Egyptians were occupying a band referred to at the time as the Isolation Belt, and it essentially was between the main part of Israel and a bunch of Jewish kibbutzim and settlements in the southern part of the Negev. And Israel was concerned that if they didn't drive the Egyptians out before it was too late, that they might actually lose the southern part of the Negev in post-war armistice talks. And so the goal of that round of fighting was to dislodge the Egyptians. And a main focus in particular was this fortress. Those of you who've been to Israel, who've traveled perhaps from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, if you look up to the high ground on the right, you'll see, you will have seen a fortress very much like this one at a place called Latrun. And these were fortresses that were built in the 1920s by the British to help consolidate their control over the country during a time of Arab hostilities. They were called Taggart fortresses in honor of Charles Taggart, an anti-terrorism expert who had recommended their construction. And they were there to consolidate administrative offices, jails, courts, things of that sort. And they were placed on high ground. And so this particular one was on some high ground in the Negev. It was occupied by the Egyptians when the British left, and they were entrenched there. And it kind of presided over some roads, and you can kind of get a sense of that even from this picture. And so Israel needed to capture this fortress to really consolidate control over the Negev. And so the decision was made to send 2 Beaufighters in an air attack against this fortress, and then to follow that with an infantry assault. And it was set for October 20th, 1948. And Stan was on the first of the 2 planes to go in, and he was still at that point trying to become a pilot of the Beaufighter, so he was flying as an additional crewman.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that mission is that when it was typically the pilot has discretion over how many passes to make over a target, depending on the value of the target and the conditions of the combat. And so there was a decent amount of anti-aircraft fire coming up from the fortress as they made their first pass. They successfully dropped their bombs, and the lead pilot, Len Fitchett, had made the determination to circle back and do a second pass. On that second pass, some of that anti-aircraft fire hit one of the engines. It started to smoke, and the plane didn't immediately nosedive. It actually was able to land. Now, this is a picture that was taken about 10 days after the plane crashed, and so it had burned obviously for many hours. But what's interesting, no, that's okay. What's interesting is that where I'm pointing there was I'm standing in what was an Arab village in 1948, which probably had about 4,000 or 5,000 people in it. And through that window, they would have seen that plane very low to the ground with black smoke trailing, lumbering aircraft. And everyone would have seen, oh my gosh, this plane's about to crash. And presumably many of them would have sort of run towards that crash site. So those sand dunes, that was a picture I took just 3 years ago in 2020. And, it looked probably more or less the exact same in 1948. And Stan's plane crashed just on the other side of those sand dunes, which was, not much more than a kilometer from that Arab village. This residential street in Ashkelon is the final resting place of that plane, which you saw previously in the picture with the sand dunes. And in fact, I took this picture. Behind me is a little playground, and the member of the missing persons unit in the Israeli Air Force, who I was with, said he was going to speak to the mayor of the city to see if they could get a plaque placed in that park in honor of Stan, Dov Sugarman, and Len Fitchett, the 3 crewmen that were on that flight. So this is a picture I took at Har Herzl, which is, Israel's Arlington. It's their national military cemetery. And this is what's called the Garden of the Missing. So this is all of the tombstones for the soldiers for whom they have never found. So I mentioned that it was about 10 days before the Israelis made it to that crash site. They only found one body, which they identified as Len Fitchett, the Canadian non-Jewish pilot. And Dov Sugarman, the British Jewish navigator, and Stan Andrews were not found. And the speculation is that they survived the crash and made it away from the site, and were probably attacked by that members of that local Arab village. This is Stan's tombstone. For those who can read Hebrew, what's interesting is it says Stanley Andrews phonetically at the top, but then Annickstein in parentheses. So I thought that was very interesting that they captured both on his tombstone.
So one of the things that Craig and I were fascinated to discover was that this logo that Stan designed back in 1948 is still in use today. Israel has now multiple fighter squadrons, but they still have a 101, sometimes referred to as the first squadron in honor of its heritage. And it still proudly flies its missions with that same logo. They have updated it, but they also retain the original. And we've been told that in the entire Israeli military, this is actually the only unit logo that has been permitted that depicts the human form. It's actually disfavored within the military, but this one was basically grandfathered in because it was so beloved by the pilots.
So I mentioned that I would read Stan's letter in full. Again, it was a little surprising to us. It was not what we expected for what would motivate someone to do what he did. I won't go into all of my reasons, but I assure you I've thought about it for some time. As you know, I'm just as cynical, cold-blooded, practical, and mercenary as you think you are. In this particular case, however, I must confess to a certain amount of idealism. Personally, I don't give a damn about Zionism. Theoretically, as a matter of fact, I think it's harmful. I'd rather see Jews assimilate into all nations rather than setting up a separate racial culture. So it's not for that reason that I'd be sticking my neck out. Briefly, it's this. For some time since I entered the army, in fact, I've been increasingly troubled about anti-Semitism and the problems of being a Jew, no matter how atheistic, in a Christian world. Not being religious, I'd never considered myself a Jew, except by accident. I find, however, that the label is forced on me, whether I like it or not. And now, out of perversity perhaps, I refuse to discard it, even if I have a chance, and I definitely do, not looking, talking, or acting what is popularly conceived as being Jewish. Merely admitting or even proclaiming loudly one's Jewishness these days is not enough, however. For one of the few times in history, there seems to be a definite opportunity to get in a few licks in the fight. The Jew has always been known as an intellectual, not a fighter, a turner of cheeks, a beggar for help against oppression, always the victim, never the victor. Every time there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism, a pogrom, or an organized campaign of extinction, what have the Jews done? Passed resolutions, sent petitions, wrote letters, made speeches, and never fought. That can be pretty frustrating and a hell of a label to carry around with you. If then we can fight back just once, I intend to do it. I don't care what the politics are in the case, although they're pretty right, actually. I just want to work off some of the endless frustration and nervous tension of hearing little flicks of anti-Semitism every day. Just little remarks that you can't poke a guy for, but have to smile and take, or pretend you didn't hear. I'm tired of hearing guys talk of Jewing someone down, of Hebe, Jew boy, or even the ones who magnanimously proclaim that some of their best friends are Jews. I'd like to be associated with the only Jews who have ever made a name for themselves as fighters, rather than talkers and book writers, although I want to be a book writer too. When these guys get through, when you hear the word Jew mentioned, you'll think of something else besides a pawnbroker or a shopkeeper.
So you may have caught his reference to fighting back, which of course is where the title of the book comes from. And we didn't mention it earlier, but in going to Israel, and so this was one of two letters that Stan sent explaining his motivation. This one was sent to one of his best friends, a guy named Herb Linden, who had flown transport aircraft in the China-Burma theater. And he also wrote a letter to his older brother, Irving, explaining his motivation. And in the letter to his brother, he provided an additional insight, which was that he and his friend Bob Vickman knew that they would have a front row seat for history, and they wanted to record that history and all of the artistic media with which they were familiar. So they brought a movie camera, a still camera, and Stan was a writer, and he wanted to write a book about his experiences. So he brought a typewriter, a paper, art supplies, and all of the rest. Bob, before Stan disappeared, Bob also was lost on a mission over Egyptian territory, also never found. They are two of, I think, only 4 airmen from the War of Independence who are still carried as missing in action. So that basically, that's Stan. That's his the basic outlines of his story, and perhaps it's a little clearer why we spent so much time trying to discover it. Thank you so much for your patience.
Yeah, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. And of course, the book's available on Amazon, and also you can check it out on our website as well, fightingback.com.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating story. If anyone has questions, go to the chat function at the bottom of your computer screen and just type away. Stan was not raised in a spiritual or religious home. When you also interviewed all of the other volunteers, American volunteers, Canadian, to the War of Independence, did you find that same narrative, or was some of the people more traditional?
You had all kinds. You had ones who had traditional Jewish traditional religious backgrounds, who had been raised in Zionist youth groups. You had others like Stan who were quite assimilated. You had some who went for the adventure. You had some who went to get away from a bad marriage. You had some who went, because they were Zionist. There really were differing motivations, and I think candidly with Stan, you saw multiple motivations sort of coexisting within a single person. So yeah, there were really and some really interesting ones were not Jewish at all, of course. There was an American Indian who fought and was actually interviewed during the war by Margaret Burke White, who was a legendary military correspondent from the Second World War. And she asked him, what's an American Indian doing here in the Middle East in a war between Jews and Arabs? And he said to her, well, I reckoned it was the Christian thing to do. It was fascinating. They were an interesting bunch.
I know one of the volunteers on the ship Exodus was actually a minister.
Correct. One was the son of a Baptist minister, and he actually headed up a dive bombing squadron. I think the 35th Squadron. Yeah, they were quite something. I'm seeing here.
Yeah, I see the question. How many American, Canadian, Jewish pilots or former soldiers went to fight for Israel's independence in 1948? Our best estimate, and I say estimate because there were not detailed records, kept the way that they would be kept perhaps today, is approximately 1,000 Americans and Canadians fought across all branches. Obviously, a much smaller number in the Air Force. But the Air Force is probably where the Americans and Canadians made their most outsized contribution. Just the leading two aces of the Israeli Air Force during the War of Independence, with 4 kills each, was an American named Rudy Augarten and a Canadian named Jack Doyle. So they made a tremendous contribution. But about 1,000. I mean, the first general in the Israeli army was Mickey Marcus, a West Point graduate. The first commander of the Israeli Navy was Paul Schulman, an Annapolis graduate. So the Americans made a huge contribution, an outsized contribution overall. And we tell the sort of more general macro story in that first book, I Am My Brother's Keeper. And then this story is more specific to Stan.
So one of the reasons some people may not have given their name was it illegal for, let's say, Americans to fight for another country way back then?
Well, Americans couldn't hold dual citizenship back then. They couldn't declare allegiance to another country. And in fact, they crafted a special oath of allegiance for volunteers. It was essentially an oath of a commitment to obey orders rather than swearing allegiance to the country of Israel. But during the war, nobody was quite sure what, if any, consequences there might be. When people returned to the States. In the end, there were 2 criminal prosecutions related to weapons smuggling, to the smuggling of aircraft in particular. There were 3 war surplus B-17s that were purchased, and not quite as dramatically as the Beaufighter escape, but were smuggled out of the U.S., flown out of from Florida. And one of those guys actually went to jail for a year. So there were 2 criminal prosecutions, but nobody was prosecuted for having served in the military.
Are there any other questions? Besides your great book, and I'll hold it up again, and also its relative, My Brother's Keeper, which is, you should get both of them and put them together in your synagogue library or the day school. But what other books on the history of around, 1948, in recent history would you recommend for those who want to know more, besides your books?
I think O Jerusalem is a wonderful book. It was written a bunch of years ago by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, and it really tells the story, I think, in quite a sweeping fashion. Yeah, I think it's a remarkable period. There was another volunteer, a British, actually not Jewish, named Gordon Levitt, who wrote a book called Flying Under Two Flags, I believe, both about his service in the British Army during the Second World War and in Israel. It's actually a beautifully written book. Craig met him, I think, back in 1998, and we told him that Craig told him on behalf of both of us, it actually was the best book that we had read from that period, from someone who had actually participated directly in the fighting. So that one was quite good. Maybe not as easy to find, but O Jerusalem should be quite available. But yeah, and there's Cast the Giant Shadow, which is the Mickey Marcus story. It's a little bit kitschy, but Mickey Marcus was an extraordinary individual. Turned it into a movie with Kirk Douglas, I think in '62 or something like that.
Frank Sinatra had a brief role.
Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, I think, has a brief cameo in there. It's kind of amusing. But yeah, it's a great period.
Yeah, Mickey Marcus went to the same synagogue as my grandfather, Union
Wow.
Temple, near Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn. So
I'll share two Mickey Marcus stories that probably our audience has not heard before. One is that as we all think about World War II, and D-Day is, Saving Private Ryan. That's the opening scene of the movie, is D-Day. So there were 10,000 Americans who jumped out of airplanes on D-Day and parachuted into, German occupied Europe. Only 2 of those 10,000 people had never jumped out of an airplane before in their entire lives. Mickey Marcus was one of those 2. So he was determined to be part of the invasion, and he wasn't going to let the fact that he had never jumped out of an airplane before stop him. And then the other story we heard, one of the volunteers that Jeff and I interviewed was a woman named Tsippi Porat. She had been Tsippi Borowski back during the war and had been a nurse, and she was well endowed, and they had her smuggling grenades in her bosom because the British were loath to search women because they were very proper. And it was a big deal because if you'd been caught with weapons during the British mandatory period, it was a death sentence. So it was a very serious thing. But so she had done some interviews after Marcus's death to talk to people, and in one of her interviews, she interviewed some Israelis, and they saw this hulking guy on the beach doing calisthenics and push-ups and jumping jacks, and so they saw that he was an American, and so they went up to him and they said, like, "What are you doing here? Like, why are you here? There's a war. You're an American." And so he pulled out his big hulking bicep, and he said, "You see that muscle? You see those veins? The blood of Abraham flows through those veins." I always loved that story.
Well, I want to thank you again. Again, the book is Fighting Back. It's something that every library should have. So I hope to thank our 2 authors, because our Jewish Book Council authors do this out of the generosity of their hearts. They don't ask for an honorarium. So we do ask that if you enjoyed their talk, which I know it's fascinating, so I know you did, think about buying it, whether it's in a bookstore or online. Thank you again. We look forward to your next collaboration.
Thank you so much.
Whatever it is.
And
We're looking forward to it as well.
Thank you so much.
Very
Really
much.
Thank you so much. Have a great
Bye.
day. Great night. Bye-bye.